I wasn't supposed to stop that night. Not with my gas tank hovering just above empty and my 5-year-old asleep in the back seat. His small sneakers pressed against the worn fabric like he trusted the world more than I ever could. But the sound cut through everything. A sharp, desperate cry that didn't belong on a quiet street past midnight. And before I could think better of it, my foot eased off the accelerator and my hands tightened on the steering wheel as the rain streaked across the windshield in long silver lines, blurring the glow of streetlights into something unreal, something almost warning me to keep driving, to mind my own business, to protect what little I had left. But I didn't. I couldn't. Because that sound wasn't just noise. It was fear, raw and unmistakable, the kind that pulls at something deep in your chest whether you want it to or not. And I remember whispering to myself, just check. Just 1 second. Like I needed permission to be the kind of person who stops, the kind of person who gets involved. And that was my first mistake. Or maybe it was the only right choice I'd made in years. I still don't know. But I pulled over anyway, tires crunching softly against the curb as the engine idled, my son shifting slightly behind me, but not waking, thank God. Because I didn't want him to see whatever I was about to step into. Didn't want him to learn this early how quickly normal can turn into something else entirely, something heavier. I grabbed my jacket from the passenger seat, the fabric still damp from earlier that evening, and stepped out into the cold air, rain hitting my face in quick, stinging drops that made me blink as I scanned the street. And that's when I saw it. A black SUV parked crooked near the intersection, one of the back doors slightly ajar, its interior light flickering like it couldn't decide whether to stay on or give up, and the crying was coming from there, softer now but still there, still calling out in a way that made my chest tighten, and I hesitated, just for a second, because nothing about this felt safe. Nothing about it felt like something a single mom working double shifts should walk toward. But then I thought about my son, about how small he looked when he slept, about how helpless kids are when the world turns its back on them. And that hesitation broke. I moved closer, each step careful, measured, my breath visible in the cold as I reached the open door and leaned in just enough to see 2 little faces in the back seat. Twins, no older than 3, strapped into their car seats with tears streaking down their cheeks, their eyes wide and searching like they'd been waiting for someone, anyone, to come back. And in that moment, everything else faded. The rain, the fear, the questions, all of it. Because they didn't need explanations, they needed help. And I didn't think. I just acted, my hands moving to unbuckle them, my voice softer than I felt as I whispered, "It's okay. I've got you." Even though I had no idea what I was stepping into, no idea whose children they were, no idea that somewhere in the dark, someone was already watching, and that the choice I made in that quiet, rain-soaked street was about to change everything I thought I knew about safety, about control, and about the kind of man who doesn't say thank you when you save what belongs to him. I could feel their tiny fingers gripping my jacket like I was the only solid thing left in their world. Their crying softening into shaky breaths as I carefully lifted one, then the other, out of their seats, their warmth surprising against the cold rain. And for a second, I just stood there, holding both of them close, my heart pounding too fast for the quiet street around us. Because this was no longer just a moment. This was responsibility. This was a line I had already crossed without knowing what waited on the other side. And I kept whispering, "You are okay. I have you." Even though I did not know if that was true, even though I had no idea where their parents were or why they had been left alone in a car in the middle of the night. And that question pressed harder with every passing second, because something about this did not feel like an accident. It felt intentional. It felt like absence, like someone had chosen not to come back, and that thought settled heavy in my chest as I carried them toward my car, glancing over my shoulder more than once, half expecting someone to call out, to explain, to stop me, but no one did. The street stayed silent except for the rain and the distant hum of traffic, like the world had decided not to get involved. And maybe that was why I kept moving, because if no one else was going to step in, then it had to be me. I opened the back door carefully, shifting my son slightly, so I could settle the twins beside him, their small bodies curling instinctively toward warmth, toward safety, and my son stirred just enough to mumble something in his sleep, his voice soft and unaware, and I froze for a second, watching all 3 of them, Three children who had no idea how close the world had come to failing them tonight. And something inside me tightened. Something protective, something fierce. And I closed the door gently before stepping back into the rain, my eyes drifting once more to the black SUV. To the open door, still waiting like a question I could not answer. And that was when I noticed it. The way the air felt different, heavier, like the silence was no longer empty but filled with something watching, something calculating, and my skin prickled before I even turned around, before I saw him standing just a few feet away, close enough that I should have heard him approach, but I had not. Tall, composed, his dark coat untouched by the rain like it respected him, like it did not dare linger, and his eyes found mine immediately, steady, unreadable, the kind of gaze that did not ask questions because it already knew the answers. And for a second I forgot how to breathe, forgot what I was doing, because everything about him felt controlled, contained, like he did not belong to chaos. He commanded it. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, calm, almost too calm for the moment. "Where are they?" Not shouted, not panicked, just certain, and I swallowed, forcing my voice to work. "They are safe," I said, gesturing toward my car, and something shifted in his expression, not relief exactly, something sharper, more precise, and he stepped closer, his presence filling the space in a way that made it impossible to ignore him, impossible to leave. "You took them," he said, not accusing, just stating a fact, and I nodded slowly, my hands still trembling slightly from everything that had just happened. "They were alone," I replied, my voice steadier now. "I was not going to leave them there." And for the first time, his gaze changed, just enough to notice, just enough to make my chest tighten again, because it was not anger, it was something deeper, something that felt like recognition, like I had just stepped into a role I never agreed to. And then he said it, quiet but absolute. "You should not have touched what is mine." And somehow, it did not sound like a threat, it sounded like the beginning of something I was not ready to understand. The words should have sounded like a warning, something that would make any reasonable person step back, apologize, and leave immediately. But they did not land that way, not entirely, because behind the control in his voice there was something else, something quieter, something that made my grip on the car door tighten instead of loosen, and I found myself meeting his gaze instead of looking away, which was probably another mistake I did not realize I was making. "They were crying," I said, my voice softer now but steady. No one was there. And for a second the rain filled the space between us, a steady rhythm that made everything feel suspended, like time had slowed just enough for me to notice the details I would have otherwise missed, the way his posture never shifted, the way his eyes did not flicker or search but stayed locked on me with an intensity that felt deliberate, calculated. And then he moved, not abruptly, not threateningly, just a single step closer that somehow changed the air entirely, like the space I had been standing in no longer belonged to me. And I felt it, that subtle shift, that invisible line being redrawn without my permission. "You put them in your car," he said, again not a question, and I nodded, my pulse still unsteady but my voice refusing to break. "Yes," I answered, because someone had to. And there it was again, that slight change in his expression, not anger, not even surprise, something more complicated, something that felt like he was reassessing me in real time, and it made my stomach tighten because I did not want to be understood by someone like him, did not want to be seen beyond what was necessary. But it was already happening. I could feel it. The way his attention lingered longer than it should have. The way the silence stretched just enough to make me aware of everything at once. The rain on my skin, the faint sound of my son shifting inside the car, the presence of this man who did not look like he belonged to ordinary problems or ordinary solutions. "They are not used to strangers," he said finally, his tone quieter now, almost measured, and I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. "They are children," I replied. "They just needed someone." And that was when something unexpected happened, something small but undeniable. One of the twins shifted inside the car, pressing closer to the window as if searching, and without thinking I turned slightly, my attention pulled back to them. And in that brief moment of distraction, the boy's small hand lifted, pressing against the glass in a silent request that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. And when I looked back at the man, he had seen it too. I knew he had, because his gaze had changed again, deeper this time, more focused, like he was connecting something he had not expected to find. "They are calm with you," he said, and it was the first sentence that sounded less like a statement of control and more like an observation he could not ignore. And I hesitated, because that felt dangerous in a different way, not immediate, not obvious, but deeper, like something was being decided without words. "I just helped them," I said quietly, but even as I spoke, I knew that was not entirely true, because children do not reach for just anyone. They do not settle that quickly unless something in them feels safe. And that realization made my chest tighten again, because I did not want this to mean anything more than it already did. Did not want this moment to stretch into something permanent, something binding. But then he stepped closer to the car, his attention shifting fully to the children now, his presence still controlled but different, less distant. And when he spoke again, his voice carried something new, something that felt heavier than before. "You are coming with us." And this time it was not a suggestion, not even a command spoken loudly. It was certainty, quiet and absolute, the kind that does not leave room for refusal, and I felt it settle over me like the rain, steady, inescapable. And for the first time since I had pulled over, I understood that stopping had not just changed their night. It had changed mine in ways I could not undo. The certainty in his voice should have made it easy to refuse, should have snapped me back into the version of myself that knew better than to follow strangers anywhere, especially men who carried power like it was part of their skin. But instead I just stood there for a second too long, my hand still resting on the edge of the car door as my mind tried to catch up with everything that had just happened. "I am not going anywhere," I said finally, the words coming out quieter than I intended but firm enough to matter, because I needed them to matter, needed to remind myself that I still had a choice in this, that I was not someone who could be moved around like a piece on someone else's board. And for a moment nothing changed. He did not react, did not argue, did not step closer. He just watched me with that same steady gaze that made it feel like he was measuring something deeper than my words. And then he shifted his attention back to the car, to the children inside, and the tension in the air changed again, softer this time, but no less controlled. "They will not go with anyone else tonight," he said, his tone calm, almost matter of fact, and I followed his gaze instinctively, my eyes landing on the twins who had settled, but not fully relaxed, their small faces still turned toward the window, toward me, like they were waiting for something, for reassurance, for continuity. And I felt it again, that pull in my chest, that responsibility I had not asked for but could not ignore, because he was right about one thing. They were not calm because of him. Not in this moment. They were calm because of me. And that realization complicated everything, made it harder to simply walk away, harder to pretend this was not already more than just a passing encounter. "I have my son," I said, gesturing toward the back seat, needing him to understand that my life was not empty, that I was not someone who could just disappear into his world without consequences. And this time his eyes shifted again, sharper now, more focused, like this was new information he was processing. "I know," he replied, and the words landed heavier than they should have, because there was no hesitation in them, no uncertainty, just quiet confirmation, and my stomach tightened as I realized what that meant, that he had noticed everything, not just the obvious, not just the twins, but my son, my car, me. And that level of awareness felt intrusive in a way I could not fully explain. "Then you understand why I cannot just leave with you," I said, my voice steadying with the logic of it, holding on to that as something solid, something reasonable. But instead of arguing, instead of pushing, he did something unexpected. He stepped back slightly, creating just enough space to make it feel like I was not being cornered. And for the first time since he appeared, the pressure eased just enough for me to breathe more fully. "You will follow," he said, not asking, not demanding, just stating it like it was already decided, like this was the compromise he was willing to offer. And I blinked, caught off guard by the shift, by the fact that he was not trying to force me into his car, not trying to take control in the way I had anticipated, but the certainty was still there, woven into his tone, into the way he looked at me, like this was simply the next step in a sequence he already understood. "And if I do not?" I asked before I could stop myself, the question slipping out because I needed to know where the edges were, needed to understand how far this would go. And for the first time, something almost like a faint smile touched his expression, not warm, not reassuring. Just a slight curve that made my pulse quicken for reasons I did not want to examine. "You will," he said quietly, and it was not arrogance, not exactly. It was something more unsettling, something that felt like certainty built on observation, like he already knew the answer because he had seen the way I looked at those children. The way I hesitated, the way I could not just turn away, and I hated that he was right, hated that he had seen through me so easily. But even as I stood there, rain soaking through my jacket, my son asleep in the back seat, the twins watching me like I was the only thing keeping their world from falling apart again, I knew that walking away was no longer as simple as it had been a few minutes ago. And that was the moment I realized this was no longer about helping for a second. This was about stepping into something I might not be able to step out of. I do not remember deciding to follow him, not in a clear, deliberate way. It was more like my body made the choice before my mind could argue, my hands moving on their own as I slid into the driver's seat, the door closing with a dull thud that felt louder than it should have, sealing something in place that I could not undo. And for a second, I just sat there, staring through the rain-streaked windshield as the black SUV ahead of me came to life, its engine silent but powerful, its brake lights glowing red like a signal I could still choose to ignore. And I almost did, my fingers tightening around the steering wheel as every practical thought rushed back at once. My job, my rent, my son asleep behind me. The life I had built piece by fragile piece. None of it included following a man like him into whatever world he belonged to. None of it made room for this kind of decision. But then I heard it again. A soft sound from the back seat. One of the twins shifting, a quiet whimper that cut through everything else. And I glanced in the rearview mirror, catching the reflection of three small faces. My son still sleeping, unaware, and the twins watching, waiting, their eyes searching for something familiar, something steady. And I realized with a sinking clarity that I had already become that for them, even if only for a moment. And that was enough to make me exhale slowly, enough to make my foot press down on the gas just as the SUV began to move. And just like that, I was following the city unfolding around us in blurred lights and empty streets, the distance between our cars never changing, like he expected me to stay exactly where I was, like he knew I would not fall behind or turn away. And that thought unsettled me more than anything else, because it meant he understood something about me I had not even admitted to myself yet. The drive stretched longer than I expected, past familiar neighborhoods into parts of the city I rarely saw, where the buildings grew taller, cleaner, quieter, the kind of places that did not advertise themselves but did not need to. And I found myself gripping the wheel tighter as we turned into a private drive, the SUV slowing as a gate ahead of us opened without hesitation, like it had been waiting, like everything had already been arranged. And I hesitated for a fraction of a second before following through, my car crossing a line I could not see but could definitely feel, the world outside shifting in a way that made my chest tighten, not with fear exactly, but with awareness, like I had stepped into something structured, controlled, deliberate. And it only became more obvious as we pulled to a stop in front of a large, quiet house that seemed untouched by the chaos of the city beyond its walls. The rain softer here somehow, the air still, and I sat there for a moment, engine running, trying to gather whatever sense I had left before stepping out. But then my son stirred again, his small voice breaking through the silence as he mumbled, "Mom," and I turned, immediately, reaching back to touch his hand, grounding myself in something real, something that belonged to me. "I am right here," I whispered, my voice steady even if I was not. And when I looked up again, he was already standing outside, waiting, not impatient, not demanding, just present, like he had all the time in the world because he knew exactly how this would unfold. And I realized then that following him here had not been the end of a decision. It had been the beginning of something much harder, because now I was no longer choosing whether to get involved. I was already inside it, and the only question left was how much of myself I was about to lose in the process. Stepping out of the car felt different than arriving, heavier. Somehow, like the ground beneath my feet carried weight I had not agreed to carry. And for a moment, I just stood there, the rain now a soft mist against my skin as I opened the back door and carefully checked on the children, my son blinking awake slowly, confusion in his eyes as he looked around at a place that was not home, not familiar. And I forced a small smile, brushing his hair back gently. "It is okay," I whispered, even though I was not entirely sure that it was, and then I turned to the twins, their faces calmer now, but still searching, still anchored to me in a way that made my chest tighten again, because I knew this connection was not something I could just walk away from anymore, not without consequences I did not want to imagine, and I lifted one of them into my arms, then the other, balancing their small weight as I stepped away from the car, my movements instinctive, careful, like I had done this 100 times before even though I had not, and when I looked up, he was still there, exactly where I had seen him last, watching, always watching, but something about his presence had shifted again, not softer, not kinder, just more focused, like this moment mattered in a way I did not yet understand. "Inside," he said, his voice low but steady. And this time I did not argue, not because I agreed, but because I knew arguing would not change anything. Not here, not now, and I followed him. Each step measured as we moved toward the house, the door already open. Before we reached it, like someone had been waiting, like everything had been prepared in advance, and that detail did not escape me. It settled somewhere in the back of my mind as a quiet warning, a reminder that this world operated differently, that nothing here happened by accident. And as soon as I crossed the threshold, the warmth hit me first, a stark contrast to the cold outside, wrapping around me in a way that felt almost disorienting. The interior quiet, controlled, every detail in place like it belonged to someone who did not tolerate disorder, and I hesitated just inside the doorway, my eyes adjusting, my senses catching up, until a soft voice broke the silence, a woman approaching. Quickly but carefully, her expression composed but attentive. "Are they all right?" she asked, her gaze moving immediately to the children in my arms, and I nodded before I could stop myself. "They are safe," I replied, and she reached out gently, not to take them, but to check them, her movements precise, practiced, and I realized then that this was not chaos, not neglect, this was something else entirely, something structured, something controlled to the point where even care felt calculated. And that realization unsettled me more than anything I had seen so far, because it meant this was not a place I could easily understand. And then his voice came again from behind me, closer now. "They stay with her," he said, and I turned instinctively, my grip tightening slightly without meaning to. "I can stay until they settle," I said quickly, the words leaving my mouth before I had time to reconsider, because the thought of handing them over, even in a place like this, did not sit right with me. Not when they were still looking at me like I was the only constant they had left, and for a second the room fell quiet, his eyes meeting mine again, searching, measuring, and then something unexpected happened. He nodded, just once, a small, controlled motion that somehow carried more weight than any command he had given so far. "You will stay," he said, and the way he said it made it clear that this was no longer about convenience, no longer about a temporary solution. It was a decision, one that had already been made, and I felt it settle over me like everything else had tonight. Quiet, inevitable, and far more permanent than I wanted it to be. Time moved differently inside that house, slower in a way that made every small detail feel sharper, louder, more important, and I became aware of everything all at once. The soft hum of air conditioning, the faint scent of something clean and expensive in the air, the way the floors did not creak under my steps as I followed the woman down a wide hallway, still holding the twins close as if letting go would break something fragile between us. And my son walked beside me now, his small hand wrapped around my sleeve, quiet in a way that told me he felt it too, that this place was not like anywhere we had ever been before, not warm in the way a home should be, but controlled, precise, like every corner had been designed to serve a purpose I could not see. And that thought lingered as we entered a softly lit room where everything seemed prepared before we even arrived. 2 small beds already made, blankets folded perfectly, a low lamp casting a gentle glow that softened the edges of the space just enough to make it feel safe, or at least safer, and I hesitated at the doorway, my instincts pulling in 2 directions at once, one telling me to stay close, to remain the anchor these children were clearly holding on to, and the other warning me that the longer I stayed, the harder it would be to leave, and I knew which one was winning. I always knew, because when one of the twins shifted in my arms, his small fingers curling tighter into my jacket, as if sensing my hesitation. The decision was already made. I stepped inside, moving carefully as I lowered him onto the bed, then his brother beside him, my hands lingering for a second longer than necessary as I adjusted the blanket around them, smoothing it down like I did for my own son every night. And for the first time since all of this started, their breathing began to slow, their bodies relaxing in a way that told me they were finally letting go of whatever fear had been holding them together. And I felt it too, that slight release, that fragile moment where everything seemed to settle, and I exhaled, quietly, brushing a strand of hair away from one of their faces. "You are okay," I whispered, more to myself than to them. And behind me, I could feel him before I heard him, that same steady presence that never rushed, never forced, just existed in a way that made everything else adjust around it. And when I turned slightly, he was leaning against the doorframe, watching, his expression unreadable but focused in a way that made my chest tighten again. Because this was not just observation. This was attention, deliberate and unwavering. And I straightened slowly, instinctively placing myself between him and the children without fully meaning to, a reflex I could not explain, and his gaze flickered to that movement, catching it, understanding it, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence stretching just enough to feel like something was being acknowledged without words. And then he stepped into the room, not close enough to crowd the space, but close enough to be part of it. "They trust you," he said, his voice quieter now, stripped of the earlier edge but no less certain, and I swallowed, glancing back at the twins who had already begun to drift into sleep, their small faces finally peaceful. "They just needed someone," I replied, repeating the same words I had said before, but this time they felt heavier, like they carried more meaning than I was ready to admit. And when I looked back at him, something in his expression had shifted again, not softened, not exactly, but less distant, like he was seeing something he had not expected to find. And that realization unsettled me more than anything else, because it meant this was no longer just about the children, no longer just about a moment of help that would fade once the night was over. This was something else, something that was starting to take shape without my permission, and I felt it in the way he looked at me, in the way the room felt smaller even though nothing had changed. And then he spoke again, quieter this time, almost thoughtful. "They have not slept like this in weeks," and I hesitated, the words catching somewhere in my chest, because there was something in them I had not expected, something that hinted at a story I did not know, a gap I had not seen. And for the first time since I stepped into this house, I realized that whatever had happened before tonight was not as simple as I had assumed, and that made everything more complicated, more dangerous in a way I could not yet define, because it meant I was no longer just helping strangers. I was stepping into something unfinished, something broken, and whether I wanted to or not, I was already becoming part of it. The silence after his words did not feel empty. It felt loaded, like something unspoken had settled between us, and neither of us was ready to touch it yet. And I found myself looking back at the twins again, at the way their small chests rose and fell in a steady rhythm, their faces finally free of tension, and it should have been enough. It should have been the moment where I stepped back, where I told myself my part was done, that I could leave now and return to the life I understood, but my feet did not move. My hands did not let go of the edge of the blanket I had just adjusted, and I realized with a quiet unease that I was waiting, not for permission exactly, but for something that would tell me how this was supposed to end. And when I finally turned toward him again, he was still watching me in that same measured way, but there was something different now, something less guarded, like the edges of whatever control he carried had softened just enough to reveal what was underneath. And it made my breath catch for a second because it was not what I expected. It was not cold or distant. It was tired, not in a physical sense, but something deeper, something that lingered behind his eyes in a way that made everything else about him feel heavier, more real. And before I could stop myself, I asked, "Where is their mother?" The question slipping out quietly, but carrying more weight than I intended, because I was not sure I wanted the answer. Not really. And for the first time since I had met him, he did not respond immediately, his gaze shifting away from me just slightly, not enough to break the connection entirely, but enough to make it clear that this was not a question he answered easily. And when he finally spoke, his voice was just as controlled as before, but there was something else in it now, something restrained. "She left," he said, simple, direct, and the words settled into the room with a kind of finality that made everything else feel smaller, quieter, and I felt my chest tighten again, not with shock, but with understanding, because I had seen that kind of absence before, not in the same way, not with the same circumstances. But the result was always the same. Children who did not understand why someone they depended on was suddenly gone. Children who learned too early that not everyone stayed, and that thought lingered as I looked back at them, at the way they slept now, peaceful but unaware, and I realized that whatever had happened, whatever had led to that moment on the street, it was not just an accident. It was a consequence, something that had been building long before I stepped into it, and that made everything more complicated, because it meant this was not something that would simply resolve overnight. This was something that would remain, something that would need to be filled, and before I could stop myself, I said, they need stability. The words coming out softer than I expected, but firm. Enough to carry meaning. And he looked at me again, really looked this time, like he was weighing every word, every implication behind it. And the silence stretched just long enough to make me aware of how far I had already stepped into something that was not mine, how easily I had crossed from helping to caring, from observing to understanding. And then he spoke again, quieter now, almost deliberate. That is why you are here. And the words hit harder than anything else he had said so far, not because they were loud or forceful, but because of the certainty behind them, the way they framed my presence as something inevitable, something already decided, and I felt it settle over me again, that same quiet weight, that same realization that this was not temporary, not in the way I had hoped, and I opened my mouth to respond, to push back, to remind him that I had my own life, my own responsibilities. But the words did not come, because somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew the truth he had already seen, that walking away would not be simple anymore, not after this, not after them. And as I stood there in that quiet room, watching two children sleep who had already begun to look for me even in their dreams, I understood that this was no longer just about a moment of kindness. It was about what came next, and whether I was ready or not, I was already part of it. I should have said no. The thought came to me clear and sharp as I stood there, watching him, feeling the weight of everything he had just said settle into something real, something that demanded a response, because this was the moment where I still had control, where I could draw a line and step back into my own life before it blurred into his, before it became something I could not untangle. And yet the word would not come. It stayed somewhere in my chest, caught between reason and something far more dangerous, something that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with the quiet image behind me. Two small boys who had fallen asleep holding on to the only sense of safety they had felt in what sounded like weeks, and I turned back to them again, needing to see it one more time, needing to confirm that this was not just emotion pulling me in, but something real, something that mattered. And there it was, the way one of them had shifted closer to the other, their hands brushing against each other even in sleep, like they were holding on to something they could not name, and I felt my chest tighten again, because I recognized that instinct, that silent reaching for something stable, something that would not disappear, and I knew exactly where that came from. I had lived it in smaller ways, in quieter moments, in the nights when I promised my son that I would always be there even when I was not sure how I would keep that promise, and that memory settled into me now, steady and undeniable, and when I turned back toward him, my voice came out before I could second-guess it. I am not staying permanently, I said, the words firm, controlled, something I could hold on to, something that made this feel less like surrender and more like a decision. And he did not argue, did not correct me. He just watched me with that same calm certainty that made it feel like he was already looking past what I said, past what I believed, and seeing what would actually happen instead, and that unsettled me more than anything else. Because it meant this was not a negotiation to him. It was a process, something unfolding exactly as expected. You will stay as long as they need you, he replied, his tone even, not forcing, not demanding, just stating it like it was already true. And I opened my mouth to push back again, to remind him that my life was not something he could measure or decide for me. But then my son's voice broke through the moment, soft and uncertain. Mom, and I turned immediately, moving back toward him, kneeling beside him as his eyes adjusted to the unfamiliar room, his small hand reaching for mine, and I took it without hesitation, grounding myself in that connection, in something that belonged to me completely. "I am here," I said gently, brushing my thumb over his knuckles the way I always did, and he looked around slowly, taking in the space, the quiet, the unfamiliar. And then he looked back at me, trusting, always trusting, and something in that look shifted everything again, because I realized that whatever decision I made here would not just affect me. It would shape his world too, his sense of what safety looked like, what it meant to help, what it meant to stay when something felt uncertain. And that realization settled deeper than anything else, heavier but clearer, and when I stood again, I did not look at the door, did not think about leaving. I looked at the twins, then back at him, and for the first time, my voice was not hesitant, not uncertain. It was steady in a way that surprised even me. "Tonight," I said quietly. "I stay tonight." And it was not everything he wanted, not the permanence he seemed to expect, but it was something real, something chosen. And as the words left my mouth, I felt the shift, subtle but undeniable, like a line had been crossed that I could not step back over so easily. And when he nodded once in response, that same controlled acknowledgement, I understood that this was not the end of the decision. It was only the beginning, because staying one night had already changed the shape of everything. And somewhere deep down, I knew that walking away tomorrow would not be as simple as I was telling myself it would be.